Hey everybody, I just wanted to get this video up so that you can have a little bit of an overview of the readings for this week as you go through the material. Um, I have also linked on Canvas directly to these slides, and I'm going to add to them every week. So if you want to take a look at them, you'll be able to do so directly through Canvas, and then I'll lecture on chunks of it every week. So today we're looking at Robert Dahl and Anthony Arblaster. And they're really a response to, I think, a lot of the questions some of you brought up at the end of last week, which is, this discussion about ancient Athens and this discussion from Helen Landemore is really interesting. How can we do things like this in a large scale democracy? And I think Dahl and Arblaster, to some degree, have answers that are similar, but I think there's a tension between the two of them, and we're going to kind of spend some time on that this week. So the first thing we're going to look at is the work by Robert Dahl in his work on democracy. So a couple of things to keep in mind here, right? In the very first chapter, he's basically laying out what he thinks is important about democracy. And I have those listed on the slides. So for him, democracy is about effective participation. And you can kind of decide what you think effective means there, right? Like, what does it mean for a citizen to effectively participate in a democracy? Equality in voting, gaining enlightened understanding, exercising final control over the agenda, and inclusion of adults. So this is his definition of a democracy. So think about ways in which, is his definition similar to that we saw with Ober and Thucydides? In some ways it is. Final control over the agenda, obviously, very much harkens back to ancient Athens. But equality in voting, I mean, Athens was less interested in voting and more interested in a more meaningful participation, right? So, when we talk about effective participation, are we talking about voting or are we talking about something else? Why does he think democracy is important? And this is from a chapter you didn't read. I just wanted you to have access to this. Dahl believes that democracy produces desirable consequences for all of these things, right? In a democracy, you are going to avoid tyranny. Essential rights are going to be protected. Freedom, individual self-determination, moral autonomy, all of those things are protected in a democracy. In addition, modern democracies produce peace-seeking and prosperity. And I think that that's really important for Dahl, right? He's saying we should care about whether or not we're a democracy because democracy produces these things, or it produces them better, more thoroughly than a non-democratic system, right? A tyrannical system or an authoritarian system. And here I just put a little slide up that shows a correlation between freedom and prosperity. There's an article that I've linked to from the Atlantic Council that goes into this in greater detail if you want to take a look. But a lot of research has been done on the relationship between freedom and prosperity, democracy and prosperity. And there is a pretty strong correlation, right? The more democratic and the more free a society is, the more prosperous it's going to be, right? And if what we want is a prosperous society, we need a free society. And Dahl believes the best way to ensure a free society is to have a democratic system. But Dahl is one of those people that says, that radical participatory democracy of Athens might be a really wonderful idea, but we live in a much more modern, complex society. We cannot have face-to-face radical participatory democracy anymore. So what do we need? Well, we need institutions, right, that are going to approximate as best as possible a democratic system, right? So what does democracy look like on a large scale? These are the essential democratic institutions that Dahl thinks any large-scale democracy needs. Elected officials, free, fair, and frequent elections, freedom of expression, alternative sources of information, associational autonomy, which basically means the ability for people to form groups, political parties, interest groups, things like that, and inclusive citizenship. And again, he doesn't say what inclusive actually means, other than, he basically says as much as possible, every adult should be able to participate, right? And that, I think, produces more debate than anything, right? Does that mean that if you are convicted of a crime, you should lose your ability to participate? Should adults automatically be registered to vote, right? So when we talk about inclusive citizenship, what exactly does that mean? We've seen some real debates about that, and we're going to continue to see debates about what does inclusion mean in that notion of citizenship. One thing to pay attention to here, though, is that Dahl is primarily concerned with democratic procedures, not necessarily democratic outcomes, right? You could have an authoritarian government that basically says, we're going to provide universal health care for everybody, right? He might think of that as a democratic outcome, but his concern is procedures. What are the institutions that we're going to follow? It's important that we have democratic institutions because he does believe that democratic procedures are more likely to create democratic outcomes, right? You are more likely to have a prosperous society, a free society, if you follow these democratic procedures, right? So he is what we might call a proceduralist or an institutionalist rather than someone who is just looking at outcomes, right? And I think that that's really, really important. So, really pay attention to the relationship between the institutions that Dahl is talking about and the way that he defines democracy, right? Because they're different. Right. When he's defining democracy, he's talking about a much more small scale, intimate democracy like Athens, right? This is the ideal. But he's saying the ideal can't be achieved in a mass society. We need something else. He says these are the trade-offs. The trade-offs are going to be these democratic institutions. So when we think about those institutions, in what way do those institutions preserve democracy? In which way do they change what democracy is, right? Rather than the citizens having the final say on the agenda, he basically says citizens should be able to vote and they should be able to express themselves, but they don't have final say over the agenda. That's for elected officials, right? So there are fundamental shifts here between his definition of democracy and the institutions of a large-scale democracy. So are we losing something in that trade-off? I think that that's really, really important to keep in mind as you read through Dahl. Arblaster wants to focus on I think something that Dahl is committed to, but maybe is a little ambivalent about, right? Arblaster says he doesn't want to focus on the government, right? Which is to say, he doesn't spend too much time focusing on elected officials, the procedures by which we elect them. He says that what's essential to democracy is the desire to bridge or even abolish the gap between the government and the governed, right? So there are people who are in power. They are the government. And there's everybody else. There's society. Those are the people that are governed. That's true in any governmental system. The goal of democracy is to bridge that gap, to make that gap as small as possible between the government, the people that are making rules and laws, and the people who have to live under those rules and laws. Arblaster argues that democracy allows us to reconcile or bring together as much as possible government and freedom, right? If freedom is the ability to do what you want, government is about controlling what you can do and what you can't, right? Government says what is legal, what's illegal, what's prohibited, what's not. How can we reconcile that? How can we be free under a system that puts rules in place? Well, we can only do it if we govern ourselves. And here he's drawing on Rousseau and a lot of early thinkers of democracy. And importantly, what he notes here is traditionally representation was designed as a way to limit the will of the people, not expand the will of the people, right? When you read Hamilton and Madison and the Federalist Papers and they talk about representation, it's not because they want to make sure that the voices of the people are heard as much as possible. It's that they want to limit the voices of the people, right? To make sure that, the voices are heard, but only in small doses, right? So if we focus on representation as our key metric for democracy, what Arblaster is saying is we're actually focusing on something that was designed to limit democracy, right? Limit the voice of the people, right? Representation was a way of increasing the gap between the government and the governed, right? If we are interested in democracy, reducing the gap between the government and the governed, we have to focus less on representation. Representation for Arblaster is sort of like a necessary evil. Yeah, we need it in society in these large-scale governments, but we should be trying to reduce the power of the representative as much as possible, we want to make sure that the governed have as much power as possible. So what is Arblaster's definition? Very simple. Democracy is popular power. For him, he says it should be seen as a continuous process of interaction between the government and society with a maximum involvement of the people in public decision making at every level. Government is not, or democracy is not, consent. This is really important, right? Oftentimes you can kind of read Dahl and say, well, government is about consent. You're consenting to representatives, things like that. Arblaster wants us to think in a very different way, because we can consent to a form of government that restricts our power, right? We can consent to a non-democratic system. We can consent to an authoritarian leader. Arblaster thinks that that's actually a violation of democracy, right? So in a way, he's saying, we can democratically renounce democracy, but that's a dangerous thing, right? And I think that this quote, just to end things, is really helpful. Democracy is conceived not simply in terms of who decides, but also as the process through which decisions and policies are made. So what Arblaster and Dahl are both doing is they're both trying to say, look, in a large-scale modern society, democracy is going to look different than it did in Athens. What does it need to look like, right? What are its essential features? Dahl gives us some institutions, right, that he wants us to focus on. Rather than focusing on institutions, Arblaster gives us sort of a goal, right? The goal of democracy is to reduce the gap between the government and the governed as much as possible. While I think that there might be some connection between that definition and what Dahl is saying, it's not a necessary connection, right? For Dahl, there is no problem with a gap between the government and the governed, as long as we have elections, as long as the representatives are elected fairly, as long as we have access to information. We can have a large gap between the government and the governed. So he doesn't necessarily see it as important as Arblaster does, right? For Arblaster, this notion of reducing the gap between the government and the governed is the most essential function, the most essential striving of every democratic system, right? So think a little bit about the tension there between what Dahl wants and what Arblaster wants in terms of the definition of democracy, in terms of what we think of the democracy, and how you can kind of think of the two of them together, but also, they both kind of offer criticism of one another, right? For Dahl, Arblaster's definition is a little too vague, right? Popular power, what does that mean? We need clear institutions so that we know exactly what we're looking for when we define democracy. And I think Arblaster is worried that if we focus almost entirely on Dahl's institutions, it's very easy for us to avoid or to not even acknowledge the central idea that Arblaster wants, which is we need a government that is as much as possible about the continuous involvement of the people at multiple levels, where people have the ability to be involved in the decision-making process. In Dahl's institutions, there is nothing that says the people are involved in the decision-making process, right? The very first institution he mentions is representative government, which means he is saying that other than voting, the citizens are not really involved in decision-making, right? So there's a gap between Arblaster and Dahl, and I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So as you go through the readings, keep this in mind. I will post the questions and assignments for this week, and like I said, I've already posted the Google Slides directly on Canvas, so you'll be able to have access to those throughout the entire mod. So that's it for this week. Good luck with everything. If you have questions about the readings, obviously, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to reach back out.